There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a quiet suburban street when two patrol cars pull up with their lights still spinning. Not the sirens, just the lights. Slow, rhythmic, blue and red sweeping across the front of my house like a warning nobody asked for. I was standing in my own driveway. My 17-year-old son, Marcus, was standing next to me, hands raised halfway, not because anyone told him to, but because that's what you do when two officers are walking toward you with their hands resting near their belts and a woman behind them pointing like she's narrating a crime documentary. "That's him," she said. "That's the boy. He's got guns in that garage." I saw it myself. My son hadn't done anything. He'd been organizing a storage shelf in our garage, moving a locked case from one side to the other, the same case he'd helped me carry 100 times before. And somehow, in the span of about 20 minutes, that had turned into a 911 call, a description of an armed teenager, and two patrol units rolling up outside our home on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The woman pointing was Denise Calloway, president of our HOA board, self-appointed sheriff of Briar Hollow Estates, and for the past 8 months, the single most persistent thorn in my family's side since we moved into this neighborhood. What Denise didn't know, what she'd never bothered to ask, because asking questions was never really her style, was that the locked case my son was carrying contained 2 firearms registered, permitted, and documented under a federal law enforcement credential. My credential, because I'm not just a homeowner on Maple Crest Lane. I'm the Chief U.S. Marshal for this district. And in about 15 minutes, 2 patrol officers were going to find that out at the exact same time Denise did, standing in my driveway, in front of my house, with her phone still in her hand from the call she made. She thought she was calling the police on a dangerous teenager. What she was actually doing was about to become the single biggest mistake of her HOA presidency. But to understand how we got to that driveway, with red and blue lights painting the front of my house and my son standing there confused and a little scared, you have to go back to the day we moved in. Because none of this happened overnight. Denise didn't wake up one Tuesday and decide to call the police on a teenager organizing a garage. She'd been building toward this for months, and I'd been documenting every single step of it. My name is Robert Whitfield. I'm 51 years old, and for the past 19 years, I've worked in federal law enforcement. I started as a deputy marshal in my late 20s, worked fugitive recovery for over a decade, then moved into judicial security before eventually being appointed chief marshal for our district 3 years ago. It's not a job I talk about much outside of work. I don't wear a badge on my shirt at the grocery store. I don't bring it up at neighborhood barbecues. To most people on my street, I was just Rob, a quiet guy who left early most mornings, kept his lawn neat, and didn't cause trouble. That anonymity, frankly, was intentional. In my line of work, you don't advertise. The less people know about what you do and where you live, the safer your family stays. So when my wife, Elena, and I bought our home in Briar Hollow Estates 2 years ago, I didn't walk into the HOA orientation meeting and announce my job title. I filled out the paperwork, paid my dues, and kept to myself. Briar Hollow Estates is a fairly standard suburban development, about 110 homes, built in the early 2000s, with the kind of HOA covenants you'd expect: lawn maintenance standards, paint color restrictions, rules about trash can placement, basketball hoops, that sort of thing. Nothing unusual, nothing draconian, at least not on paper. The house itself is a single-story ranch on a half-acre lot, with a detached 2-car garage set back from the street. It's the garage that matters here, because the garage is where the entire conflict with the HOA started, and it's where it very nearly ended in disaster. We have an in-ground sprinkler system, a privacy fence along the back property line that I had surveyed and permitted before installation, copies of which I keep filed both physically and digitally, a habit from years of dealing with property disputes and chain of custody paperwork, and a driveway long enough to fit 2 vehicles without blocking the sidewalk. Everything about our property was done by the book. Permits pulled, inspections passed, HOA architectural review submitted and approved in writing before a single fence post went into the ground. I want to be clear about that, because it matters later. Every modification we made to that house, we did the right way. We didn't cut corners. We didn't assume. We asked, we documented, and we waited for written approval before proceeding. My wife, Elena, works as a hospital administrator at a regional medical center about 20 minutes from our home. She's the more outwardly social of the two of us, She actually attended the HOA's welcome orientation when we first moved in, introduced herself to several neighbors, and for the first few months, genuinely tried to build the kind of friendly rapport you'd hope for in a new neighborhood. I mention this because it matters. We weren't a closed-off, antisocial family hiding behind a fence. We were simply private about certain specifics, the way most people in sensitive professions have to be, while still being perfectly normal, friendly neighbors in every other respect. My son, Marcus, is 17. He's a junior in high school, plays on the school's baseball team, and spends a fair amount of his free time helping me around the property, mowing, trimming, organizing the garage, washing the cars. He's a good kid, quiet, respectful, the kind of teenager who says yes sir and no ma'am without being told to. He's never been in trouble at school, never had so much as a noise complaint filed against him. I say this not because I think a parent's word should be taken at face value. I understand better than most people that good kids can make bad choices, but because it's relevant to what happens later when an HOA president decides, based on absolutely nothing, that my son is a threat to the neighborhood. Now, about the firearms. As part of my role, I am authorized, and in some respects required, to maintain certain firearms at my residence. This isn't unusual for federal law enforcement officers in leadership positions. Depending on assignment and threat level, agencies often require personnel to have secure, accessible storage at home. Mine are kept in a locked, fireproof gun safe in the garage, bolted to the slab, with biometric and key access. I have the appropriate federal credentials, state permits, and documentation for every weapon in that safe. I've also got a concealed carry permit issued by the state, which I maintain separately for personal use, completely apart from my service weapons. None of this is illegal. None of this is hidden. If anyone in an official capacity, police, a legitimate investigator, even a properly noticed HOA inquiry through the right legal channels, had asked me directly, I would have shown them documentation without hesitation. I have nothing to hide, because I've done nothing wrong. But Denise Calloway never asked me directly. That wasn't her style. Denise had been president of the Briar Hollow Estates HOA board for 6 years by the time we moved in. From what I gathered through neighbors and the HOA's own meeting minutes, which I started requesting and archiving fairly early on, again, a professional habit, Denise ran the board less like a community organization and more like a personal fiefdom. She had opinions about everyone's landscaping. She had opinions about what kind of curtains were visible through people's front windows. She had, at one point, sent a formal violation notice to a family 3 doors down because their Halloween decorations were, in her words, tonally inappropriate for the neighborhood's aesthetic. I want to emphasize, I'm not telling you this to paint her as a cartoon villain before she's done anything. I'm telling you because it's the truth, and the truth is what eventually mattered most in this story. Denise had a pattern, a long one, and my family was about to become her next target. Not because we'd done anything wrong, but because we were new, we were private, and in Denise's mind, privacy was the same thing as suspicious behavior. There was another incident, one I only learned about secondhand from a neighbor a few houses down, involving a young couple who'd put up a small above-ground pool for their toddler the summer before we arrived. Denise had apparently shown up unannounced, measured the distance from the pool to the property line with her own tape measure, and issued a violation notice the same afternoon, citing a setback requirement that, as it turned out, didn't actually apply to temporary above-ground structures under the HOA's own bylaws. The couple eventually had the notice overturned on appeal, but not before weeks of stress and a fairly public dispute at a community meeting. It was a small story, almost forgettable on its own. But once I heard it, it told me everything about the kind of pattern we were dealing with. It started small. A note on our door about trash cans being visible from the street 11 minutes after the scheduled pickup time. A complaint about a vehicle, my unmarked government sedan, being parked in the driveway instead of the garage, despite there being no rule requiring otherwise. A pointed comment at a community meeting about certain new residents who seem to think the rules don't apply to them. I didn't engage much with any of it. I responded to written notices in writing, calmly, always citing the actual HOA covenant language when relevant, and otherwise let it go. I dealt with far more serious conflicts professionally for 2 decades. A handful of passive-aggressive notes from an HOA president wasn't going to rattle me. What I didn't fully appreciate, not yet, was how far Denise was willing to take things when she felt ignored. And I definitely didn't anticipate that her fixation would eventually land on my son, my garage, and a legally registered firearm, turning a Tuesday afternoon into a police response at my own front door. That escalation didn't happen all at once. It built, conversation by conversation, complaint by complaint, until the day she finally crossed a line that had nothing to do with property values and everything to do with my family's safety. The first real confrontation happened on a Saturday morning in early spring, about 6 weeks before the day with the patrol cars. Marcus and I were in the garage. I'd had the door up because it was a nice day, mid-60s, light breeze, and we were going through our usual weekend routine. I'm organizing the tool wall while I cleaned out the gun safe, which I do periodically to check on humidity levels and make sure everything's properly maintained. The safe was open. Both firearms were visible to me, but not really visible from the driveway. You'd have had to walk fairly far into the garage and look directly at the safe to see anything. I heard the click of heels on the driveway before I heard her voice. "Mr. Whitfield." I turned around. Denise Calloway was standing just inside the garage entrance, arms crossed, wearing the kind of expression people wear when they've already decided how a conversation is going to go before they've said a single word. "Good morning, Denise," I said, sliding the safe door mostly closed out of habit more than concealment. There was nothing illegal happening, but I've never been comfortable with strangers getting an unobstructed view of my home's security setup. "Can I help you with something?" "I think we need to talk about what's happening in this garage," she said. "What's happening in this garage," I repeated, "is that my son and I are organizing some tools and doing routine maintenance." "I saw a weapon," she said. "A gun. In a case. Open. In your garage, with a minor present. I want you to notice something here, because it's going to matter a lot later in this story." Denise didn't ask if there was a gun. She didn't ask if it was legal, if it was secured, if my son had any access to it at all. She stated it as a violation, fully formed, the way you'd announce a verdict. "I'm a licensed firearm owner," I said calmly. "I have a concealed carry permit through the state, and the firearms are stored properly in a locked safe. What you saw was me performing routine maintenance, which I do periodically. The HOA has rules about weapons being visible on the property," she said. This is the part where I want to pause and explain something important, because it's a tactic I'd already started to recognize from her previous complaints, and it's worth naming directly for anyone who's dealt with an HOA board operating in bad faith. Vague rule citation. "Denise," I said, "can you point me to the specific covenant or bylaw that addresses firearm storage or visibility? Because I've read through our HOA's governing documents fairly thoroughly, and I don't recall anything like that." She hesitated. "Just slightly. It's a community standards issue. Common sense. We don't need it written down for everyone to understand that having weapons visible around children is inappropriate. My son is 17, I said. He's not a child wandering by. He lives here. And there was no weapon visible in any meaningful sense. It was inside a locked safe that I was checking, in my own garage, on my own property. I'm going to need to file an incident report with the board, she said. You're welcome to file whatever you'd like, I said. I just asked that whatever you file accurately reflects what actually happened, rather than what you're characterizing it as. She didn't like that. I could see it land. The small flicker of irritation that comes when someone realizes the person they're trying to intimidate isn't going to fold. This is exactly the kind of attitude that causes problems in this neighborhood, she said. New residents who think they don't have to follow community norms. I followed every norm and every written rule when we moved in, I said. I just asked that any concerns be raised through the actual process, with the actual rules, rather than assumptions about what you think common sense should require. She left without saying much else. But I remember standing in that garage afterward, watching her walk back down the driveway, and feeling something I want to be honest about, a flicker of real concern. Not for myself. I've spent 2 decades handling far more volatile confrontations than an irritated HOA president. My concern was narrower and more specific. It was about Marcus. He'd stood there quietly through the entire exchange, the way teenagers do when adults are arguing around them, trying to figure out how worried he should be. After Denise left, he looked at me and asked, "Is this going to be a problem?" No, I told him. It's not going to be a problem, because we haven't done anything wrong. But I want you to understand something important, and I need you to really hear this. I sat him down on the tailgate of my truck, parked in the driveway, and I explained it to him as plainly as I could. If anyone ever asks you about the safe, or the guns, or anything related to my job, you tell them the truth, that we keep things locked up properly, and that you don't have access to it without me. You don't argue with anyone about it. You don't get defensive. You stay calm, you stay polite, and you let me handle it. Can you do that? Yeah, he said. Of course. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think it's worth sitting with for a moment before we keep going. If a neighbor walked into your garage uninvited, saw something completely legal, and immediately escalated it into an incident report, without asking a single clarifying question first, how would you have responded in that moment? Would you have stayed as calm as I did, or would something in you have wanted to push back harder right then and there? I ask because I think the instinct to push back hard, immediately, is completely understandable. I had 19 years of professional training telling me to stay level, document everything, and let the facts speak. Most people don't have that training. Most people, faced with a stranger walking onto their property and accusing them of endangering a child over a legally stored firearm, would have reacted with anger. I don't think that reaction would have been wrong. I just think, in this particular case, staying calm was the better long-term strategy, and as you'll see, it ended up being the only thing standing between my family and a genuinely dangerous outcome a few weeks later. Because that Saturday morning conversation wasn't the end of it. It was the opening move. Over the following weeks, Denise's incident report turned into a formal complaint filed with the HOA board. The board, to their credit, mostly seemed uninterested in pursuing it. From what I later learned through the meeting minutes, 2 board members had pushed back, asking Denise to cite the specific rule being violated, and she'd been unable to produce one. The complaint was tabled, not dismissed, just shelved in that particular bureaucratic way that means nobody wants to deal with it, but nobody wants to officially kill it either. I thought that might be the end of things. Denise had made her point, the board hadn't backed her, and life would go back to normal. I was wrong. Denise doesn't let things go. And the fact that the board hadn't sided with her didn't make her back down. It made her angrier, more convinced that there was some kind of conspiracy protecting certain residents, and more determined to find something, anything, that would force the issue. She just needed an opening. And about a month later, she got one. The opening came on a Thursday afternoon, and it started with something that had absolutely nothing to do with firearms at all, at least, not at first. I'd parked my work vehicle in the driveway that day instead of the garage. It's an unmarked sedan, dark gray. Nothing about it visually distinguishes it as a government vehicle. I'd left it out because I was heading back into the office later that evening for an unscheduled briefing, and it was easier than pulling it out of the garage twice. Denise apparently drove past, saw the car, and decided this was worth investigating personally. I wasn't even home when it started. Elena was. She told me later that Denise had walked straight up our driveway, ignored the doorbell, and instead walked around to the garage, which was closed, and tried to peer through the small window on the side door. Elena said she heard footsteps on the gravel path along the side of the house before she even realized someone was there. By the time she stepped outside, Denise was already cupping her hands against the glass, trying to see past the reflection. It wasn't a glance in passing. It was a deliberate, sustained attempt to look into a closed structure on private property, and Elena said it took her a second to even process what she was seeing, because it was such an unusual thing for a neighbor to be doing in broad daylight. When Elena came outside to ask what she was doing, Denise's response was, and I'm quoting this directly because Elena wrote it down immediately afterward, something she'd started doing after the first incident. I have a right to inspect HOA properties for compliance issues, and I have reason to believe there are unregistered weapons being stored on this property in violation of community safety standards. There is no such right in our HOA's governing documents. I want to be unambiguous about that. Nothing in our covenants grants board members a right to inspect private garages without notice, request, or any legal process whatsoever. Denise was, in plain terms, trespassing and attempting to conduct a search she had no authority to conduct. Elena, to her credit, handled it about as well as anyone could. She didn't let Denise into the garage. She didn't engage in an argument. She simply said, "You're welcome to put any concerns in writing to the board, but I'm going to ask you to leave our property now," and went back inside. That should have been the end of it. Instead, Denise went home and, According to what we later pieced together from neighbors and the HOA's own records, spent the next several days building what she apparently believed was a case against us. She started asking neighbors questions. Had anyone seen weapons on our property? Did anyone know what kind of work I did? Was anyone else concerned about the situation on Maple Crest Lane? Most neighbors, from what I gathered, found the questions strange and mostly ignored them. But a couple of newer residents, who didn't know us well and didn't know Denise's history, apparently took the concerns at face value. By the following week, Denise had escalated from informal inquiries to a certified letter. I still have it. I've kept every piece of correspondence from her, the same way I'd keep evidence in any other professional context, because some part of me, call it instinct, call it 19 years of pattern recognition, told me this wasn't going to resolve itself quietly. The letter cited a laundry list of supposed violations: improper vehicle storage, the unmarked sedan, unauthorized commercial activity, apparently because a neighbor had seen me leave early in tactical gear once, months earlier, for a training exercise, and decided I must be running some kind of business from home. And this is the one that mattered: concerns regarding unsecured and potentially illegal firearms posing a risk to neighborhood children. The letter went on to state that if these violations weren't addressed within 14 days, the HOA board would be compelled to involve local law enforcement to ensure community safety. I called the HOA's management company, which handles administrative functions separate from the volunteer board, and asked for clarification. The woman I spoke with, a property manager named Patricia, was apologetic and clearly uncomfortable. "Mr. Whitfield, I want to be honest with you," she said. "This letter didn't go through our normal review process. Denise sent this directly using board letterhead, but 2 other board members have told me they weren't consulted on it. So this isn't an official board action?" I asked. "It's complicated," Patricia said. "Denise is the president. She has some authority to act on the board's behalf. But sending unilateral threats about police involvement over something like this, that's not standard, and frankly, it's not something I'd advise." "Has this happened before?" I asked. "Letters going out without full board sign-off." There was a pause on the line, the kind that tells you the answer before the words do. "I'm not really in a position to discuss other residents' situations," she said carefully. "What I can tell you is that this isn't the first time I've had to have this particular conversation with someone on your street." I appreciated her honesty, but it also told me something important. Denise wasn't operating with the board's full backing. She was operating on her own authority, or what she believed her authority to be, and she was willing to invoke law enforcement as a threat without anyone else signing off on it. That's a particular kind of escalation that should concern anyone. Threatening to call the police isn't a community standards tool. It's not a negotiating tactic. It's an invocation of force, of armed officers showing up at someone's home and treating it casually, as a way to win a dispute about a fence or a parked car, is something I'd call genuinely reckless. I responded to the letter in writing, calmly and specifically. I noted that the vehicle in question was used for employment purposes and that no HOA covenant restricted personal vehicle parking in a homeowner's own driveway. I noted that there was no commercial activity occurring on the property. And regarding the firearms, I stated clearly, in writing, that all weapons on the property were legally owned, properly permitted, and securely stored in compliance with all applicable laws, and that I would be happy to address any specific, legitimate concern through the proper channels, but that I would not be providing private security details about my home to a board member acting outside of an official, board-approved process. I sent that letter by certified mail. I kept a copy. I also, for the first time, mentioned to Elena that I thought it might be worth letting a few trusted colleagues know what was happening, just as a precaution. Not because I thought anything was going to happen imminently, but because in my line of work, you learn to recognize the shape of an escalating situation before it fully arrives. And this one had a shape I didn't like. I want to ask you directly, does this sound like a legitimate community safety concern to you? Or does it sound like someone using the threat of police involvement as a personal weapon in a dispute they couldn't win through normal channels? Because I think there's a meaningful difference between raising a genuine concern and threatening armed intervention to force compliance with rules that don't even exist on paper. For 2 weeks after that letter, things went quiet. No more notes on the door. No more drive-by inspections. I genuinely thought, for a brief window of time, That my written response, calm, factual, clearly establishing that I wasn't going to be intimidated but also wasn't hiding anything illegitimate, had settled things down. Denise didn't contact us again for those 14 days. The HOA management company didn't follow up. Life went back to its normal rhythm. Marcus had baseball practice most afternoons. Elena was deep into a work project, and I was juggling the usual demands of the job along with ordinary weekend chores around the house. I should have known better than to let my guard down. But I did, a little. And that's exactly when things actually got dangerous. Not because Denise escalated through any official channel, but because she decided, apparently on her own, to stop asking questions and start making accusations directly to the police. There's a particular kind of relief that settles into a household after a conflict seems to have cooled off. You don't talk about it directly. You just notice that dinner conversations go back to normal topics. Marcus's upcoming game, a work trip Elena was planning, whether we needed to reseed part of the backyard. Nobody mentions the HOA. Nobody mentions Denise. It's not that you've forgotten. It's that the tension has loosened enough for ordinary life to fill the space again. That's roughly where we were for about 3 weeks. Marcus had a tournament 2 towns over, and I made it to both of his games that weekend, something that doesn't always happen given my schedule. We grilled out afterward. Elena's project at work wrapped up successfully, and we celebrated with a quiet dinner on the back patio. The new privacy fence finally fully grown in with the climbing vine she'd planted along it the previous fall. It looked, for those few weeks, like an entirely ordinary suburban life. Lawn mowed on Saturdays. Trash cans brought in promptly. No notices on the door. I'd be lying if I said I completely let my guard down. There's a habit you develop after enough years in this line of work, a low-level awareness that doesn't fully switch off, even during calm periods. I still glanced at the mailbox a little warily. I still noticed when an unfamiliar car slowed down near our house. But the acute tension, the bracing for the next letter feeling, had genuinely faded. Marcus seemed to feel it too. He'd been quieter than usual in the weeks right after the garage confrontation, the kind of quiet that comes from a kid turning something over in his head without quite knowing how to talk about it. But by that 3rd week, he was back to his normal self, cracking jokes at dinner, complaining about his coach's new batting drills, asking if he could have friends over that weekend. Watching him relax made me relax a little more than I probably should have. I'd mentioned to a colleague at the office, almost in passing, that the HOA situation seemed to have settled down. He was someone I trusted, a senior deputy who'd worked with me for years, and he'd raised an eyebrow when I first told him about the firearms accusation weeks earlier. People like that don't usually just stop, he said. They go quiet when they're regrouping, not when they're done. I told him I appreciated the perspective, but that I thought this particular situation had simply run its course. The board hadn't backed her. I'd responded clearly in writing. There wasn't anywhere left for the complaint to go, procedurally speaking. Looking back, I think part of me wanted to believe that, because it was easier than sitting in a constant state of low-grade vigilance about something as mundane as an HOA dispute. We'd dealt with the actual substance of the conflict. The facts were clearly on our side. It seemed reasonable to assume that would be the end of it. What I didn't fully account for was that Denise wasn't operating from facts. She never had been. The entire conflict, from the very beginning, had been driven by something else entirely. A need to be right, to be in control, to have her authority over the neighborhood acknowledged and obeyed without question. And 3 weeks of silence wasn't her backing down. It was her waiting. I think, in hindsight, the quiet period might have actually made things worse, in a strange way. Because it meant that when she finally did act again, she acted without any further warning, without another letter, without another driveway confrontation where I could calmly state our position and create a paper trail. She skipped straight past all of that. She went straight to 911. And she did it on an afternoon when I happened to be at the office, 25 minutes away, completely unaware that anything was happening at my house until I got the call that would turn out to be one of the more unsettling phone calls of my professional life. Not because of any danger to me, but because of what it meant was happening, right at that moment, to my son. The call came in at 3:47 in the afternoon. I remember the time specifically because I looked at my phone the instant it rang and felt that particular drop in my stomach that comes when a number you don't recognize calls during a time you weren't expecting any calls at all. It was Elena, but she was using a neighbor's phone, Her own was inside the house, and she'd stepped out onto the lawn in a hurry. "Rob, you need to come home right now," she said. Her voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the effort behind that control. "There are police cars outside." Denise called them. "She's saying Marcus has a gun." I was in the car within 90 seconds, badge and credentials in my jacket pocket where they always are, driving with the kind of focused calm that 19 years of training builds into you. Fast, but not reckless, because arriving safely and clear-headed mattered more than arriving 30 seconds sooner. Those 25 minutes were, without question, some of the longest of my life. I've sat through standoffs. I've coordinated fugitive recoveries that went sideways in real time. None of that compared to the specific helplessness of driving toward my own house, knowing my son was standing in front of armed officers, and being unable to do anything but watch the speedometer and the road. Here's what had happened, reconstructed afterward from Elena's account, the responding officer's reports, and Marcus's own description of events. Marcus had been in the garage that afternoon, door open, reorganizing a storage shelf as part of a chore list I'd left for him before heading to work that morning. Part of that task involved moving the gun safe slightly to access shelving behind it, something we'd discussed, and something he'd done correctly. The safe itself remained locked the entire time. He was moving the case from one side of the garage to the other, sliding it along the floor rather than lifting it, since it weighs close to 90 pounds. Denise was apparently driving past, for the third time that week, according to a neighbor's account given afterward, and saw a teenager dragging a large, dark case across a garage floor. From a moving vehicle, at a glance, she decided this was a weapon being moved by an unsupervised minor. She didn't stop to ask. She didn't knock on the door. She drove straight to the end of the street, called 911, and reported what she described as a teenage boy carrying a large firearm in an open garage, possibly preparing to use it. No adult supervision visible. I want to be very clear about something here, because it's important to the rest of this story. The 911 call Denise made was not a minor exaggeration. It was a fabrication built on a glance and an assumption, escalated into language specifically designed to trigger an urgent police response. Possibly preparing to use it is the kind of phrase that moves a routine welfare check into an active threat response. And that's exactly what happened. 2 patrol units were dispatched, treating the call with appropriate seriousness given what they'd been told. By the time the first unit arrived, Marcus told me later, he hadn't even known what was happening at first. He'd heard a car door, then a second one, then looked up from the shelf he was organizing to see 2 officers approaching the open garage with their hands resting near their belts, not drawn, but ready. He said his first thought wasn't fear exactly. It was confusion. He hadn't done anything, and for a few seconds, he genuinely didn't understand why anyone would be approaching him that way. Then instinct took over, the kind of instinct that comes less from any single conversation and more from a lifetime of absorbing, consciously or not, what to do in exactly this kind of moment. He set the case down slowly, stepped back from it, and raised his hands partway, palms visible, and waited for instructions rather than offering any of his own. By the time I arrived, both units were parked at the curb, lights still on, and 2 officers were standing roughly 20 feet from my driveway, where Marcus stood with his hands raised partway, not because they'd ordered him to do so forcefully, but because, as he told me afterward, he'd seen enough news coverage of similar situations to know that keeping his hands visible and staying calm was the safest thing he could do. I need to say something here about the officers themselves, because it matters, and because I think it's important for people to understand that this story isn't about police behaving badly. The officers on scene, I later learned their names were Officer Daniels and Officer Reyes, were doing exactly what they're trained to do given the information they had. They hadn't drawn their weapons. They were keeping a calm, measured distance, speaking to Marcus in even, non-threatening tones, asking him simple, clear questions. What's in the case? Is there anyone else in the house? Can you tell us your name? Marcus, to his enormous credit, did exactly what I'd told him weeks earlier. He stayed calm. He answered clearly. He told them the case contained a legally owned firearm belonging to his father, that it was locked, that his father was a federal law enforcement officer, and that his mother was right there and could explain everything. I arrived in the middle of that exchange. I parked at the curb, deliberately leaving distance between my vehicle and the scene, and I called out clearly before approaching. Officers, I'm the homeowner. My name is Robert Whitfield. I'm reaching for my credentials now, federal ID, it's in my jacket pocket. This is a habit, again, built from years of training. Announcing your intentions clearly before making any movement, especially in a tense scene, so officers never have to guess what you're doing. Officer Daniels approached me with appropriate caution, professional but not hostile, and asked me to slowly produce identification. I did. I handed him my Marshal service credentials along with my driver's license. I watched his expression change in stages. First, focused scrutiny, checking the credentials carefully. Then a flicker of recognition, not personal recognition of me, but recognition of what the badge represented. Then, finally, something that looked almost like relief, because I think on some level, every officer responding to a call like this is hoping the situation turns out to be far less dangerous than it was described. "Sir," he said, "can you confirm the firearm in that case is registered to you?" "Both firearms in that safe are mine," I said. "Federally issued service weapons, along with documentation, plus a personal firearm under a state-issued concealed carry permit. All of it is properly licensed. My son has no independent access to the weapons themselves. The safe requires biometric or key entry that only my wife and I have." We were told there was an unsupervised minor handling a firearm with no adult present, Officer Reyes said. "My son was moving a locked storage case as part of a chore," I said. "The case was never opened. There's no firearm that was handled in any meaningful sense. It was inside a locked safe the entire time." I watched Denise during this entire exchange. She was standing near the sidewalk, arms crossed, and I want to describe her expression carefully, because it tells you something important about how this entire conflict had been built from the start. She didn't look relieved that the situation seemed to be far less dangerous than she'd reported. She looked frustrated, almost disappointed. "He had it out," she said, stepping forward. "I saw him carrying it across the garage. That's not locked in a safe. That's a teenager carrying a gun around in the open. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think it's a question worth sitting with. Have you ever seen authorities called over something this minor? A teenager doing a chore, completely within his own family's property, escalated into language about weapons and threats, simply because someone assumed the worst from a passing glance? How often do you think that happens? And how often does it go this far before anyone stops to check the actual facts?" Officer Daniels turned to her calmly. "Ma'am, can you describe exactly what you saw?" "Specifically, I saw him dragging a big black case," she said. "I know what a gun case looks like." "Did you see the case open at any point?" he asked. "No, but did you see an actual firearm at any point? Outside of a case?" "No, but that's not the point. The point is a minor was handling a weapon with no supervision." "Ma'am," Officer Reyes said, still even, still professional. "Based on what you've described, and based on what we're seeing here, it sounds like a closed, locked storage case was moved from one part of a garage to another. That's different from what was reported to dispatch." I want to give real credit to both officers here. Neither one of them dismissed Denise rudely. Neither one of them took my side simply because of my credentials, at least not yet. They were still working through the facts methodically, asking clarifying questions, treating the situation with the seriousness it deserved until they had enough information to properly assess it. That's exactly how it should work. Authority, when it's functioning correctly, doesn't take anyone's word as final. It checks. And checking is exactly what was about to change everything. "I'd like to step into the garage and verify the safe and the case, if that's all right with you," Officer Daniels said to me. "Of course," I said. "I'll show you everything." "Marcus, you can lower your hands. Son, you're all right." I watched something shift in my son's posture the moment I said that. The kind of full-body release that happens when a kid realizes the adults around him have the situation handled. He'd been remarkably composed through the entire encounter, but he was still 17, and there's only so long that composure holds before it needs somewhere to go. I walked the officers into the garage. The case Marcus had been moving sat exactly where he'd left it, undisturbed, latched and locked. I knelt down, showed them the two latches and the small padlock threaded through them, and waited for Officer Daniels to nod before I touched anything further. Small gestures like that matter in moments like this. Letting the people doing the verifying control the pace of the verification rather than rushing to prove a point. I opened the gun safe using the biometric scanner and showed them both firearms inside. a department-issued sidearm with serial number documentation, a secondary service weapon, and my personal firearm with its concealed carry permit clipped to the inside of the safe door, where I keep all relevant paperwork for exactly this kind of situation. Officer Daniels took his time with each document, comparing serial numbers against the paperwork, checking dates of issue, turning each page over as if he expected something to not line up. Nothing didn't. These are documented, current, and registered appropriately, Officer Daniels said, reviewing the paperwork. Sir, can I ask, what's your role with the Marshal's service? I'm the Chief Marshal for this district, I said. Both officers' expressions changed in a way I've seen before in my career, not deference exactly, but a recalibration. The kind of recalibration that happens when someone realizes a situation they walked into with one set of assumptions actually has an entirely different shape than they expected. Officer Reyes glanced at his partner, a brief, almost imperceptible look that said more than either of them would have put into words out loud. I appreciate you walking us through this, Officer Reyes said. I want to be straightforward with you. The call we received described an active, urgent threat. Based on what we're seeing here, that's clearly not what was happening. This is the part of the story where Denise, who had been standing at the edge of the garage the entire time, decided to interject again. This is exactly the kind of secrecy I've been talking about, she said. Nobody in this neighborhood knew he had this job. Nobody knew there were government weapons in that garage. That's a serious community safety concern, regardless of paperwork. I want to address this directly, because it's a tactic worth naming. When the actual substance of an accusation falls apart, when it becomes clear that no law was broken, no danger existed, and the situation was fundamentally what I'd said it was from the very beginning. People who've invested heavily in being right often pivot to a different complaint entirely, rather than acknowledging the original claim was wrong. Ma'am, Officer Daniels said, turning to her, I understand you have concerns, but I want to clarify something for the record. You called dispatch and reported an unsupervised minor actively handling a firearm with no adult present, framed as a potential active threat. That's a significant difference from what we're finding here. A legally licensed firearm, secured in a locked safe, that was never removed from storage. I reported what I saw, Denise said. I have every right to report safety concerns in my own neighborhood. You absolutely have the right to call if you believe there's a genuine emergency, Officer Reyes said. I just encourage some caution before describing something as an active threat involving a weapon, when what you actually observed was a closed case being moved. Calls like that carry real weight, and they can put people in danger unnecessarily, including the person being reported on. I watched Denise's face during this exchange, and I think this is the moment worth sitting with, because it's the turning point of the entire story. Up until this point, every confrontation had gone roughly the same way. Denise made an assertion, I responded calmly and factually, and the conversation ended in a kind of stalemate where she walked away unconvinced but unchallenged by any actual authority. This was different. This time, there were two officers standing in my garage, looking at documented evidence, asking her direct, specific questions she couldn't satisfactorily answer. The vague accusations that had worked in HOA letters and driveway confrontations didn't hold up under the structured, fact-based scrutiny of an actual investigation. I want to be clear that I take community safety seriously, I said, addressing the officers but loud enough for Denise to hear clearly. If there were a genuine concern here, I'd want it investigated thoroughly, and I'd cooperate completely. I have nothing to hide. Every firearm in that safe is documented. Every modification to this property was permitted and inspected, and my son has never had unsupervised access to any weapon in this house. I retrieved, from a folder I keep in a small fireproof box near the safe, another professional habit, keeping critical documents accessible, copies of my federal credentials, the concealed carry permit, the fence permit and survey from when we'd installed the back fence, and the HOA's own written approval of our garage shelving modification from over a year earlier. I'd also like to mention, I said, turning toward Denise directly for the first time in the conversation, that this isn't the first time concerns have been raised about this property without going through the actual HOA process. There was a certified letter sent several weeks ago, on board letterhead, threatening police involvement over a parked vehicle and an unsubstantiated firearms claim. I responded to that letter in writing, and I have a copy, along with confirmation from the HOA's management company that the letter wasn't authorized by the full board. This was the moment the entire situation tipped. Officer Daniels looked at Denise with a different kind of attention now. Not hostile, still entirely professional, but clearly recalibrating his understanding of who, exactly, had created this situation and why. "Ma'am, is that accurate?" he asked her. "Was there a prior unauthorized letter sent regarding this property?" Denise didn't answer immediately. And in my experience, both personally and professionally, that hesitation tells you almost everything you need to know. "I sent correspondence regarding documented community concerns," she finally said. "That's part of my role." "Was that correspondence reviewed and approved by the rest of the board before it went out?" Officer Daniels asked, his tone still level, still entirely without accusation, simply curious in the way good investigators are curious. Not trying to trap her, just trying to understand the actual sequence of events. "I have discretion as president to act on urgent matters," she said. "Were the firearms in that letter an urgent matter, in your assessment? Or were they the same firearms we're looking at right now, stored exactly the way they're stored right now, that you'd already raised weeks earlier?" It was a simple question, almost gentle in how it was delivered, but it cut directly to the heart of the entire pattern. Because the answer, obviously, was that nothing had changed between the first confrontation in my garage and this one. The firearms had been legal and properly stored the entire time. The only thing that had actually changed was Denise's level of frustration that nobody, not me, not the board, and now not the responding officers, was treating her assumptions as settled fact. She didn't answer that question directly. Instead, she shifted again, the way people do when a line of questioning gets too close to something they don't want to sit with. "I just don't think it's appropriate for a family to keep this kind of secret from the rest of the neighborhood," she said. "People have a right to know who they're living next to." "Sir," Officer Reyes said, turning back to me, "for what it's worth, there's no requirement under any law I'm aware of for a resident to disclose their employer or occupation to a homeowners association. Is that something you're aware of as well, given your position?" "I have the authority to act on behalf of the board," Denise finally said, though noticeably quieter than she'd been throughout the rest of the encounter. "That may be a question for your HOA's governing documents and possibly its insurance carrier," Officer Reyes said evenly. "What I can tell you, from a law enforcement standpoint, is that today's call described an active threat that did not exist. That's a serious matter on its own, separate from any HOA dispute. I want to explain what happens, procedurally, after a call like this, because I think it's useful for understanding what consequences actually looked like in this story, and I want to be honest that it wasn't dramatic in the way movies might portray it. There was no arrest made on the spot. No handcuffs. Nothing theatrical. What did happen was this. Officer Daniels explained to Denise, calmly and clearly, that false reporting of an emergency, particularly one involving an alleged weapon and a minor, language specifically chosen to escalate police urgency, could be investigated as a false report, depending on the department's review of the call. He noted that this wasn't a decision he'd make personally on the spot, but that the call would be documented and reviewed, and that the department took false emergency reports seriously given the resources and risk involved in dispatching units under the assumption of an active threat. "I'd also encourage you," he added, "to think carefully before contacting emergency services over neighborhood disputes that don't involve an actual, observed emergency. This situation could have gone very differently if anyone here had reacted with less composure than your neighbor's son did." That last part stuck with me, because it was true, and it was the part that genuinely unsettled me more than anything else that happened that day. My son had handled a tense, frightening encounter with two armed officers, summoned to our home over a fabricated threat, with a level of composure that prevented things from escalating further. He'd done exactly what I'd taught him to do. But he shouldn't have had to. No 17-year-old should have to manage that kind of encounter at all, let alone because a neighbor glanced at him from a passing car and decided to call it in as an active threat. Separately from the police department's handling of the false report, I followed up directly with the HOA's management company the following morning. I provided Patricia, the property manager, with a full written account of the incident, along with copies of all prior correspondence, the original garage confrontation, the certified letter, and now this. I requested, in writing, that the full board review Denise's conduct, given that this was now a documented pattern of unauthorized action taken in the board's name, culminating in a false emergency call to police. The board did review it. I wasn't in the room for that meeting, but Patricia relayed the outcome to me about a week later. 2 other board members had apparently already grown uncomfortable with Denise's unilateral actions over the preceding months. The Halloween decoration complaint, the above-ground pool incident I'd heard about secondhand, and several other documented overreaches with different families that I hadn't even known about until this came up. My situation became the final, undeniable example the board needed to act on. Patricia told me that during the meeting, one of the board members had specifically referenced the pool incident from the year before, pointing out that this was now the second time Denise had acted on an assumption, escalated it using authority she didn't actually have, and caused real distress to a family before anyone checked whether her assumption held up. The difference this time, obviously, was the involvement of armed police officers and a minor, a difference significant enough that even board members who'd previously been reluctant to challenge Denise directly were no longer willing to stay quiet. Denise was removed as board president through an internal board vote, retaining her position as a general board member but losing her authority to issue notices, send correspondence on the board's behalf, or represent the HOA in any official capacity going forward. The board also issued a formal written apology to my family, acknowledging that no HOA action had ever been properly authorized against our property, and confirming in writing that there were no outstanding violations on our account. As for the false report itself, the police department's internal review concluded that the call met the threshold for a documented false report, though given the absence of any prior similar conduct directed at law enforcement specifically, the outcome was a formal warning rather than criminal charges, a decision within the department's discretion and one I didn't push back on. My focus, from the beginning, had never been about punishing Denise as harshly as the system would allow. It was about making sure my family was safe, on record, and free of further harassment. I think it's worth asking yourself this. Do you think Denise expected any of this when she made that call? Do you think, in the moment she dialed 911 and described my son as an active threat, she pictured this outcome, losing her position, facing a formal warning, having her own conduct become the subject of scrutiny instead of mine? Or do you think she fully expected the system to simply validate whatever she said, the same way it always had before, with no one ever checking the actual facts? I don't think Denise was a fundamentally cruel person, for what it's worth. I think she was someone who had been given a small amount of authority over a long period of time, had never really been checked or questioned in that authority, and had come to genuinely believe that her assumptions carried the same weight as fact. That's not a unique personality type. It's a fairly common one, in HOAs and plenty of other small institutions where oversight is thin and nobody pushes back hard enough, early enough, to correct the pattern. What made this situation different? What made the consequences actually land? Wasn't dramatic confrontation or clever maneuvering on my part. It was simply documentation, calm communication, and a refusal to let vague accusations go unchallenged. Every letter I kept, every written response I sent instead of an angry phone call, every calm explanation I gave instead of a defensive outburst, all of it became the record that mattered when an actual, accountable authority finally needed to evaluate what had really happened. It's been about 4 months since that afternoon in the driveway, and I want to be honest about where things stand now, because I think a story like this deserves an honest ending rather than a triumphant one. Denise still lives on our street. We see her occasionally, checking the mail, walking her dog in the evenings. The interactions are brief and entirely civil, a nod, sometimes a small wave. There's no warmth there, and I don't think there needs to be. But there's no hostility either, at least not anymore. The complaints stopped completely after the board's decision. No more letters, no more drive-by inspections, no more comments at community meetings about residents who think the rules don't apply to them. Marcus, for his part, handled the aftermath better than I expected, though it did leave a mark. He's mentioned, a couple of times since, that he still thinks about standing in that driveway with his hands raised, not because anyone told him to, but because some instinct told him that was the safest way to be perceived in that moment. That's not something I want any 17-year-old to have learned from personal experience. And it's a piece of this story that doesn't resolve neatly just because the HOA situation did. We talked about it a fair amount in the weeks that followed, more than I think either of us initially expected to. He asked me, at one point, whether I thought he'd done the right thing, whether raising his hands, staying quiet, letting the officers lead the conversation was actually the correct response, or whether it was just the response fear had trained into him. I told him honestly that I thought it was both. That staying calm and visible in a tense, uncertain encounter is almost always the safest immediate choice, regardless of whether you've done anything wrong, and that there's no contradiction between that being true and it also being deeply unfair that he had to make that calculation at 17, in his own driveway, over at shore. He went back to baseball within a few days, back to his normal routines fairly quickly on the surface, but Elena and I both noticed small changes for a while afterward. A slightly longer pause before walking out to the garage alone, a habit of glancing toward the street more than he used to. Those things faded over the following months, gradually, the way most things do with time and normal life filling the space back in. But I don't think they disappeared entirely, and I don't think it would be honest of me to claim otherwise. What I keep coming back to, when I think about everything that happened, isn't really about firearms, or HOA authority, or even the police response itself. It's about the gap between assumption and verification, how quickly an assumption, stated with enough confidence, can travel from a passing glance out a car window to an emergency dispatch describing an active threat, and how the only thing that stopped that gap from causing real, lasting harm was a series of people, 2 patrol officers, a property manager, 2 board members, who were willing to slow down and actually check the facts instead of simply accepting the loudest, most urgent version of events. The HOA, for what it's worth, has been functioning differently since the board changes. Patricia mentioned, the last time we spoke, that the new board president has been far more careful about following proper procedure, requiring written documentation before any formal notice goes out, and requiring board consensus before any escalation involving outside agencies. I don't know if that's directly because of what happened with us, or simply a natural shift that was already overdue. Either way, it's a healthier process than the one that existed before. I don't feel any particular satisfaction about what happened to Denise, and I want to be honest about that too. I don't think anyone should walk away from a story like this looking for revenge or vindication as the takeaway. What I feel, mostly, is relief that my son is safe, that the situation resolved without anyone getting hurt, and that the systems that are supposed to check unchecked authority actually work the way they're supposed to, even if it took longer than it should have. If there's a lesson in this story, I don't think it's really about HOA specifically, or even about firearms ownership. I think it's about the value of staying calm, documenting everything, and trusting that facts, eventually, tend to hold up better than assumptions, even when it feels, in the moment, like nobody in a position of authority is taking your side. It's also, maybe just as importantly, about teaching the people we're responsible for, kids especially, how to handle moments of real pressure with composure, even when the situation around them is deeply unfair. My son didn't do anything wrong that day. He shouldn't have had to manage an encounter with armed officers over at shore. But the way he handled it, calmly and clearly, made a difficult situation survivable in a way that I don't take for granted. I've thought a lot, since all of this happened, about how differently it could have gone. A less composed teenager, a less careful pair of officers, a homeowner with less documentation or less patience. Any one of those variables, shifting even slightly, could have turned that afternoon into something far worse than an HOA dispute resolved with a board vote and a formal warning. That's the part of this story I keep returning to, more than the outcome itself. Not how it ended, but how easily it could have gone a different direction. If this story resonated with you, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you took a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps these stories reach more people, and it lets me know these accounts of unchecked authority and the moments when accountability finally catches up are worth continuing to tell. I've got another story coming soon, one involving a property line dispute that escalated in a direction almost nobody saw coming, and an HOA board that learned a very expensive lesson about exactly whose land they were dealing with. I think you're going to want to see how that one unfolds. In the meantime, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever dealt with an HOA, a neighbor, or a board member who used vague rules or outright assumptions to justify overreach? What happened? And how did you handle it? I read through these regularly, and some of the most compelling stories I've come across for this channel have come directly from viewers sharing their own experiences. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.